everyone, and welcome to Russell Tobin's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion webinar, Moving from Intention to Action. My name is Matt Stanford and I'm the Associate Director of Operations for Russell Tobin in the UK. I'm really excited to be hosting today's event. We know that this topic is top of mind, not only for organisations, but for many of us personally. After the events of last year, effective DE&I at work is no longer a nice to have, but it's an essential part of working culture. Today, we're going to be sharing insight and real life examples of how we can turn last year's good intentions into action. We have a hugely impressive panel today, and we're encouraging questions. So please do send any questions through for our panelists in the Q&A box. I want to start off by introducing the panelists today. Firstly, we have Gloria Sinclair Miller, who is the Field Services Director for Shurn and a consultant for Frost Included. Gloria is an accomplished senior HR business partner with more than 25 years of success in HR across a variety of industries, including banking, retail, and pharmaceutical. Rafi Karim Aladina is a consultant with Frost Included. Rafi is also co-author with Stephen Frost of Building an Inclusive Organisation. His recent client work has encompassed engaging the leadership of several FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 companies, as well as working with government agencies. Finally, Jeffrey Williams is Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Dr. Martens. Jeffrey has an extensive human resources experience in recruitment, talent management and diversity inclusion. He has led the cross-business strategy that utilises D&I as a value-adding model to businesses and has close to 20 years of experience in the industry. Thank you all so much for being here during what I know is a hugely busy time for all of you at the moment. Let's start with the first question. 2020 saw a lot of good intentions for promises for change with regards to diversity, equity and inclusion from both inside and outside of work. With so many of us in work finding ourselves busier than ever at the current time, let's start by asking why it's so important that we now move forward into action in 2021. Gloria, would you like to start us off with this one?
Sure, I'm happy to. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I think it's critically important that we move to action right now. As Matt, you stated, I've been in HR for over 20 years. I know I started when I was 12. And I've been in a variety of roles where leading an HR team or leading our organization around talent and diversity has been critically important. And I think at this point in our history, there are many companies out there that have been doing this for years and they never took their foot off the gas, if you would, as the events transpired over the last year. And they're making strides because they've been able to embed diversity and inclusion as part of their strategic business imperative. But that said, there are a lot of organizations out there where it becomes the flavor of the month, I hate to say, but it does. It is something that, I need to make a comment about this. I need to make sure, specifically for me, based in the US, that I have an affirmative action plan. I need to make sure I'm checking the boxes around, goals and things like that. But that's not having a discussion. That's not creating an inclusive workforce. That's just being compliant, if you would. And it really is important that we move from being compliant and diversity friendly to really thinking about how do we create an inclusive workforce? How do we move to action? And our world's demanding it. If we don't move at this point, I always say 2020 was a waste. Like, it was a time for us to really learn our lesson. And if we don't move and if we don't create more equity in our workplaces, if we don't address racism, if we don't have honest conversations, where are we going to be? And we have a younger generation who who grew up with a more inclusive, if you would, in some cases, environment. And as they're now looking for jobs, and as I think about my work with SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, we're seeing our emerging professionals that are demanding that we have more inclusive workplaces. They want to work in a world where they not only see themselves, but they get to see a variety of individuals and experiences come through. So I think this movement to action is critically important for us serving today, but I think even more important for our future generations.
Yeah, thanks, Gloria. That's great insight. And Jeffrey, would you have anything more to add on that from the UK perspective?
I think Gloria's kind of made all the points, but I would say it's that piece of us being honest with ourselves. If you think about what 2020 did, it held up a mirror to how we live as a society and how we operate as organizations. And I think, this conversation of moving from, oh, it would be nice to do this, to actually doing it, is us being honest with ourselves to say, do we want to be here in another 10 to 15 years having this conversation about gender equality, having conversations about racial equality? Let's hope that we don't want to be doing that. We want to be in a position where we actually understand the gravitas of having workplaces that truly reflect our societies, of having spaces where people can show up and talk about the experience they have within your organization, and that you will look at your policies and your practices and make those necessary changes. So I think, the conversation is about, yes, we can all see it now. Let's stop pretending that we can't. Let's embrace that we can see this, and let's do the work to change it. And I think that's where we're sitting at the moment.
Great. What are some of the steps that we can take on a personal level and perhaps for leaders in our organizations to make real progress and promote change here? Because, for example, if someone wants to become an ally, how can they take action?
Well, I think maybe if I can kind of jump in for a second, I think part of the issue is that I think, as Gloria said, for a lot of people, this is the flavor of the month sometimes, but that doesn't mean that we can't turn that into continual action, right? And I think part of the difficulty is around just when people come to this for the first time. If you are someone who is a middle-aged, straight, white male person, and you're experiencing everything that people are talking about, and you haven't really approached this topic before, it's kind of overwhelming and it can be difficult. And I can understand that. I can empathize with that. And part of the difficulty of just trying to be an ally is when you don't necessarily know what that means practically. Like, you can know what it means intellectually, knowing that, okay, I'm going to stand up against racism, but practically, what does that mean, right? Like, what does it mean in terms of how you behave in a meeting? What does it mean in terms of when you're sitting with your friend who is a Black female and someone comes and was like, oh my God, your hair is so cool, and start touching your hair? Like, what do you do in that moment? And I think giving people the opportunity to practice that can be really useful. So one of the things that we often talk about is something called partnering, where in a meeting, Gloria and I are in a meeting together and we've decided to be partners. Then my job as a man is to focus on Gloria and make sure that in that meeting, when I notice some kind of discriminatory behavior or microaggression against her as a woman, she can see that, or she can see that, I can see that. And when I notice that, it's my job to call it out, not hers. And that kind of takes the burden off of the member of the marginalized group from having to speak up about it themselves, which we know is just less effective at creating change because people need to hear it from members of the majority group. But also it gives me an opportunity to practice being an ally without having to focus on everyone and everything that's happening. And it's important that Gloria and I talk about it beforehand, that we agree that this is what we want to do, and we agree how we might want to call that out. So maybe Gloria wants me to call it out in the meeting and very strongly, and that's something that I can do. Or maybe instead she wants me to kind of take that, make a note of it, and talk to the person outside the meeting afterwards. And if I have that knowledge of this is exactly what I need to do, then it just makes it a little bit easier to practice being an ally. And over time, with that kind of practice, I'll start noticing it about other people or other groups or other marginalized members of society, and be able to become an ally for a broader set of people. And over time, you just get used to it.
And I think, what I would add as well is, if you are a leader, in whatever sense that means to you, and you have a sphere of responsibility, take a look at that sphere of responsibility and see, what does it look like? How many women sit within your line of reporting? How many people of color? What are their experiences? Where do they sit in the structure? As you think about building your teams, think about who you go to, who you give the opportunity to, recruit on your behalf, or, looking at your supply chain. How many small organizations are you partnering with? I think, allyship, yes, it's about being in those meetings and having those conversations and using your influence that way. But if you are a leader in an organization, you also have a lot of responsibility and duty of care to the people that report into you. And I think it's that piece of also understanding your actual line, your reporting structure. So I think sometimes working in this role, I have conversations with people saying, what can I do? And I'm like, okay, tell me about your team. And they don't have an answer. So, I'm going to send you back into your organization and take a look at your team, and then come back to me and let's talk about the people that you actually have a day-to-day responsibility for. Because I think sometimes, to Rafi's point, it's those kind of moments of, how am I an ally? Well, actually, if you're a leader, you have responsibility, and owning that responsibility and finding those moments for you to step up. I'd also say it's about putting it on your agenda. So if you have a leadership team, making sure that every quarter you are talking about D&I, and what does your data tell you? What does your team look like? And having those moments. And I think it's also, figuring out what you want to stand for and verbalizing that with everyone that reports into you. Because I think, again, sometimes everyone's like, I want to be an ally. But if you haven't verbalized anything, you're kind of talking into the wind. So you need to verbalize your position so that people know, actually, Jeffrey stands for this. This is what Jeffrey wants to see. So as I report into him, I'm going to take the action to make sure that I'm following his lead. And that for me is what good leadership would look like in this space.
Good. And I think as we begin to emerge slowly out of the pandemic over the course of this year and next, it's likely we're going to have a lot of people working from home, working in offices, spread out in locations across the country, even across the globe. So what changes do you think businesses will need to make to ensure that they're building a truly inclusive culture across the board?
So I'll start that.
Yeah, thanks, Gloria. Yeah.
I'll kick that one off. So I think the first thing we all have to realize is we keep talking about going back to normal. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the normal that we all experienced in 2019. And I think many of our businesses and our senior leaders are slowly but surely starting to realize that everyone potentially will get vaccinated and everyone will come back into the office, and we're going to have these same office dynamics that we had back in 2019, or that if those who were not able to go into a remote setting because they were frontline workers who continue to deliver or be in healthcare or whatever that occupation was, their normal looks completely different than it did when we started the year last year in 2020. So I think the biggest thing is going to be, one, we've got to recognize that it's a new normal. And as we go back into a more, let's say, calmer time, as we continue to move into 2021, where we're seeing that there are organizations that are starting to open up. And again, it depends on where you are in the world. And for me in the US, where you are in the country, where we're actually seeing that happen. But I think we have to recognize a few things as it relates to inclusion. One is the pandemic highlighted inequities. It didn't create inequity. It highlighted ones that were already there. So we saw that from a gender perspective, more women dropped out, if you would, of the workforce, because when everyone came home and we were starting those with children, women who had to now be, in addition to whatever that day job was, they had a second day job of being teacher, lunch lady, recess coordinator for their child or children. and eventually had to decide which one is more important for me. So recognizing that that's still going to create a gap in our workplaces, and how do we create some flexibility to bring women back into the workplace? And that's one. There are other inequities that we have to be able to face as well. Again, going back to emerging leaders and young professionals who, maybe they were coming out of college and they didn't get a job right away. So now they've had a year of unemployment, a year where maybe they didn't go back to school, maybe they didn't finish degrees. So what does that now do? How is that going to impact our future workforce? And let's go even further, because in some industries, they were starting to recruit in middle schools because of talent gaps that they had, specifically in STEM areas. But we saw kids dropout rates increase in various parts of the country and the world. So what happens now? Again, and here in the US, we're seeing kids start to go back, teenagers start to go back into schools. But what impact is that going to have later, that year of remote learning, where some of them just dropped out of it completely and now they're going to reemerge? Are they going to get held back? So I think those are all inequities that organizations eventually will need to face. And I think the last point I would make is we're also going to have to think about how mental health had an impact on individuals. We were used to collaborating, traveling, going places, interacting with people, and some people shut down during this time, or some people are going to struggle to re-engage. So one of the actions that I think we're going to have to really think about and help our leaders with is, how do we teach people how to re-engage again? Because that's going to be part of building this inclusive culture again. It's almost like we've got to step back to move forward a bit as we re-engage.
I think one thing I might want to just add to that, just building off of what Gloria said about this pandemic highlighting the inequities that already exist, is that it also means that now that we're going into this new normal, we have found ways to deal with the changes that have had to happen in the last year. So more people working from home and having flexible working hours. But that also means that there's no reason why those can't necessarily carry on in the future, even when people are all vaccinated and are able theoretically to go physically back into the office. I think, most organizations used to have some sort of flexible working arrangement that you could request. And I know from personal experience with colleagues that was often denied. People wanted you to be in the office physically from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or whatever the hours were for you. And now they can't really justify that anymore. And so I think managers and leaders will have to start to individuate a lot more the way that they work with individual people. So this actually presents a tremendous opportunity to be even more inclusive of people's individual circumstances. So, maybe that means that, we have to deal with these societal issues, like the fact that women still bear the overwhelming share of household labor, which leads to more women dropping out of the workforce in the last year. It leads to inequities, say, for example, in academia, where men have been publishing more in the last year than ever before, and women are publishing less than ever before, because even though everybody's at home, women are taking on even more of that household labor. And so we do have to deal with those societal issues. But as part of that, the workplace now has a tremendous opportunity to help with that by just tailoring the way that people can work so that it fits better into their lives.
Some great points there. Anything to add, Jeffrey?
I was, so I'm kind of been nodding my head to Gloria and Rafi and saying, definitely. I think it's also that piece, I think to Rafi's point, the way we view talent, the way we view people, the way we view HR has shifted. This is a new bastion. We all have to kind of work together to find that solution of what the new normal, which is not a really great phrase, but new normal is. And I think it's that piece of, making sure that we understand, that everyone understands what the policies are, where they sit at the moment, what we are going to do to support people's mental health, and then also what return to work actually means. Because I think, a lot of organizations are doing that research into how people want to work. But I think they're also taking a look at how they can save money in office space. So if you are making these decisions as well, how does that impact your people? And finding that kind of middle ground and that variable is going to definitely be the important action.
I think that's what somebody said before about it's a great opportunity, isn't it, for making these company culture building moments, if you like. What recommendations specifically would you have for companies that are looking to try and take this as an opportunity?
I think, for companies trying to take this as an opportunity, I think it's that leaning into two-way communication to make sure that you are actually listening to your people. So I know a lot of businesses are doing surveys at the moment saying, how would you like to work? But actually listening to that and putting, in a way, the opinion of the majority over the leadership at the front of the floor of your decision making. I think it's also that piece of looking at and understanding the nuanced experience of individuals that work in your business. So, speaking to people that are working parents, what do you need? What are your experiences? How might it differ to someone who's not a working parent? Asking the questions of, your grads and your intern audiences, and making sure that you understand how they're currently living. Because a lot of them during this pandemic were actually living in, flat shares with other individuals, all trying to work around a dining table or working in their bedroom and being in their bedroom for, a good 10 solid hours a day. Again, that's not fit for purpose. So, how are we going to support them to either be able to get back into the office or to go to spaces where they can, be outside of their rooms? So I think it's that piece of looking at where you are right now, listening to your people and asking the right questions of your people as well. And in all honesty, all of us that are working in this space, we're all living it too. So, it's not like we're sitting there not aware of what people are experiencing, because we're also experiencing it. So leaning into our own experiences and bringing that into the process as well is what I would suggest.
Yeah, and I would jump in and I completely agree with that. And I think the big thing is what Jeffrey said is, one, there's this commonality that we all shared this experience over the last year and a half. It wasn't segmented to one part of the country or world. So there's that common piece that I think everyone has that understanding. I think there's also, to expand on what Jeffrey said, this welcoming in part of, as we're coming back to whatever that is, where people are remaining remote or they're coming back into the office one day a week, one day a month, whatever that situation is, because the flexibility piece is going to be key. It's almost like reset and day one. Think about how many people changed jobs during the last year. There are people who have never gone to their office. Like, they don't even know what headquarters looks like, including Jeffrey, that don't even know what headquarters look like, have never had to interact with their coworkers outside of a Zoom or WebEx meeting. So now we're almost having to retrain people how to re-engage with each other and reminding people how to interact. And it sounds basic and crazy, but it's true, that we're so used to doing this and that we can shut our camera off and we're done. But that doesn't happen if you're back in a office setting where someone's now sitting next to you. And what happens if they're individuals who are going to stay remote? So I'm in a situation where I've always been remote, and it was very interesting for me to watch my colleagues when they went remote, and how in the beginning, no one had their camera on when we had meetings. And then slowly they started to get comfortable with turning their cameras on. Well, now my office is half of the population is back in an office 4 days a week. So watching that dynamic change of people not turning their cameras on, or people sitting at their desk, they're not going into conference rooms. But I think there's also this, how do we now have conversations and interactions where we're bringing people back together. And I think about, my workplace and things that have happened in the US. Think about everything that's happened in the last year. So in the US, we had a contentious election period. We've had lots of conversation and examples of racial and social unrest. All of that played out while we were still at home and having very interesting chats in social media or in offices where we couldn't really see the person sitting next to us. But now we're going to have that conversation, and people are going to be right in front of us, and retrain people on those. And then there's also this piece of people were impacted by loss of life. And people weren't able to grieve the way that normally you're able to do that. And there may be workplaces where people are no longer there. So how do we prepare people to handle that? And this all ties into that creating an inclusive workplace, is just really recognizing the place and the path and the journey that so many people have been on over the last year. And for all of us to be able to acknowledge that and give people the space that they're going to need.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't know if there's anything you've got to add on that, Rafi. Any points there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one thing I'm thinking about is we have this one client that I've been working with who is a scientific research organization. And one of the difficulties that they've been facing is that, as a research facility, with people who are, some of the people who work there are Nobel Prize winners, and they are managing these labs that are working on, things like how aging affects the development of different kinds of cancers and things like that, right? These are really important areas of research and lines of research. And all of a sudden, a lot of them had to go home. They couldn't be in the lab anymore. And the only people who were allowed there on campus were people working on COVID-19 related issues. And so when your sense of self is tied to your work, which it is for a lot of us, for many of us, and when your work is tied to that physical location, how do you maintain that sense of connection to such a fundamental part of your identity? And how has that sense of connection changed when you physically go back to the office, particularly when you've been told that your line of work is no longer quite as important as someone else's for a certain period of time, right? So the people who are going back to the office right now, or the people who have been in the office this whole time, are considered essential. Does that make me not as essential anymore? And how does that affect the way that I think about my workplace and my place in it and my place in the world? And what does that mean for how I might need to change the way that I think about what work means for me? And that's going to require different kinds of management and leadership techniques that haven't necessarily been employed in the same way before. And I think it goes back to that real opportunity to connect with individuals and how they are doing and how they work as individual people, and treat them the way they want to be treated.
Some great points there. Everybody's had a different experience from the last 12 months, and it's really about recognizing that, isn't it? So I think I've got another question here, which is more around the ever elusive notion of work-life balance, and what should organizations be doing to make sure we're seeing an effective work-life balance, especially as inclusion has come more and more into focus on a global scale? So how practically can we see that happening with people, and to also manage the work-life balance? I don't know if Jeffrey, you want to start with that? Or?
Yeah, sure. So I would say it's about the work-life balance conversation is interesting because we kind of all have these lovely mobile phones that we're walking around with in our hands that we're constantly using and responding to, questions at times that we probably should put them in a drawer and leave them alone. But I think the piece about work-life balance is looking, again, I keep talking about policies, but I think it's looking at your policies and quantifying what they mean, readdressing that with your leadership and your managers and saying, do you know something? We need to make sure that our employees are only doing a certain amount of hours a week. So is it 40 hours a week, 35 hours, whatever's on their contract. We want to make sure that they are sticking to that and they are switching off. I think there's a lot of technology now, so I don't know how many people are using like Microsoft or any of those different bits of insights, and kind of really looking at those insights as your organization and looking at how much time are people actually spending responding to emails, what are the times they're doing that, and then putting in checks and balances. So at the moment, I know I'm looking at doing some stuff around, switching off between lunch hours. So making sure that everyone has some downtime between 12 and 2, and making sure that as a business that we are doing that. Or looking at how, we can integrate some kind of up and down periods as well. So like there's core hours and you work within those core hours, but then there's also hours where you can dip in and out. And I think, again, going back to what we said in the last response, it's about having those individual conversations and understanding what people need and making sure that you're, as a line manager, that you actually lean into the word trust with the reality of what trust actually means. Because I think a lot of the time, when you look at all of the research that's happened over this COVID period, we as humans have actually delivered more for our organizations than we did when we were going somewhere 9 to 5 every day. And I think, we've definitely demonstrated that people can work flexibly, they can work in different ways, and that, businesses are not going to fall down and our economies are not going to crumble. So I think it's that piece of, as a line manager and responsible for someone's health and well-being, that you look at your duty of care and you lean into trust.
Yeah, and I think one thing I wanted to add on this is that it's also about communicating a little bit more clearly what those individual circumstances might be for yourself and how people can respond to that. So for example, if your life requires you to work, or maybe you just want to work from 9 a.m. to noon and then take a few hours and then start up again at 7 p.m. or something and work for a few more hours, then you're probably going to need to send some emails out after 7 p.m. And so one thing that I've seen some of my colleagues do and some of my clients do is they add a little thing in their email signature that says, these are my work hours. I may send you emails outside of your work hours. I don't expect a response. Just to kind of set that expectation for other people. And I think people are quite generous with that. They understand that everybody has individual circumstances, and they're more generous with that now after the events of the last year than I think perhaps before. And so being able to say that very clearly helps take the receiver of that email a little bit off the hook, so they don't have to respond in that time. And also it means that if you've been very clear that these are my work hours, then no one's going to expect you to send them an email back outside of those hours, because they know that you're not in the office otherwise. And I think that that's a really, really effective way of just communicating some of that work. The other thing that I've been seeing a number of people do is in their email signatures, just adding something about how they are expecting emails back, and just saying that, I only expect you to respond when you feel like you can, or saying I really need an email within the next day, or something like that, which can really just help people feel like they can prioritize, because they're getting tons of information thrown at them in the middle of a very stressful time period. So like, for example, for myself, like, yes, we've been in the middle of a pandemic. I've also moved from one state to another, and I'm moving again in 2 months. I've dealt with immigration issues, which are stressful entirely because I'm a Canadian, but I live in the US. And, with all of those things going on, and, people getting sick and having more work and things like that, it's difficult to triage things. And so if people are setting those expectations for each other, at least internally within companies, you can make at least a little bit more headway in just helping people make their lives a little bit easier. And I think that's, at the end of the day, part of the point, is just help people do their jobs a little better by helping people live their lives a little bit easier, because it's really hard right now.
That's a really good point. Gloria, have you got anything to add on that?
No, I think both Jeffrey and Rafi covered that. The only other word I would add is I stopped calling it work-life balance. I started calling it work-life integration. because it's really around how do we integrate these pieces into our lives, and it's everything that Jeffrey and Rafi both said, and it is about communication. And I don't think we can reinforce that enough. It's a two-way communication between you as that individual and whoever that group or manager is that you need to interact with. It's just so critical.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, which has just come through on the chat. Many of us involved in D&I believe it's about leadership, as has been mentioned. If the current leadership is in an organisation is not representative, how do you address the concerns of those currently in post who believe change means their job is at risk? I don't know who wants to take that one first.
I can jump in.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
So I can, Gloria and Rafi are laughing. I guess that is the, one of the $100 million questions of D&I work. And I would say, for me personally, what I've done over the years is I've focused very much on, one, instilling in this leader the idea of their legacy and what they will actually, when they transform this organization in this way, what it means to, how people will remember them and talk about them. I also, do push the idea that to make this change does not mean that they have to lose out or that they suddenly do not have a seat at the table. Their knowledge, their experience has got what got them to where they are. However, the organization needs to represent the societies that they operate and work in. For me, I'm now recently joined Dr. Martens, and we are a commercial business looking at selling to consumers. So we need to represent those consumers, and we need to make sure that, we're not going to have any foul steps in our marketing campaigns, in our branding campaigns, because we don't have the right people sitting around the table. So effectively, I think it's a combination of leaning into that leader's ego, but also leaning into the commercial value of the D&I conversation and taking it out of the social justice movement. Because I think a lot of the time people feel like, oh, we're just going to hire someone to be really nice to that woman or to that Black person because aren't we fantastic people? Effectively, we all work for businesses that want to make a profit. And that is not how D&I should be integrated into your organization. It should be a fundamental part of your business and making sure that you actually are able to engage, communicate, and talk to those that you want to sell your services to, but also attract those people to consider working for your organization. So I think it's about that mindset shift. I think it's about the conversation for that leader. And in all reality, it's also a little bit of chasing the financial rewards at the end of that tunnel of diversification, in my opinion.
Rafi or Gloria, have you seen anything across your clients that can complement that or even differ for that?
No, I would just reinforce that. I think the only other piece I would add to that is it's a journey. Like, this isn't something that's going to happen day one. And I think making sure that leader understands, I love it's part of your legacy, but it's also, you're not just going to go out and hire a person of color or a certain gender or something just to make a statement. Like, you want to start to create a talent pool where you're starting to really invest and promote whatever that group is that isn't represented at the leadership levels in your organization. And it's not just the senior leadership levels. Like, yes, we know that there is definitely an opportunity in most organizations at the most senior level, but that comes from building the bench. And that comes from differentially investing in talent programs and recruitment opportunities to bring in a different perspective and bring in diverse voices and bring in, and recruit in areas that you may not have recruited in before. But you have to look at your organization and go, where is my opportunity? Is my opportunity in certain parts of the business? Like, maybe my sales force does represent the community that I am targeting, but my R&D space or my technical space does not. So then you're putting plans in place in order to really look at what does my talent pool look like from a recruitment perspective, and then internally from a promotion perspective to get to that level 2, 3, 5 years from now. So it really is an investment, and it really is thinking about how is this part of my strategy.
And I think just building on that, one thing I would add is that if you're just adding more diversity without working on the inclusion side, if you're without working on the equity side, those diverse people are just going to leave because it sucks as a workplace. Like, that's it at the end of the day, is that if you've not created an environment where people from these different backgrounds feel like they're heard and they're valued and like they belong and like they have a voice there, where their opinion based on their different experience actually brings value and they feel that they're appreciated for that different value that they bring. If they don't feel that, they're going to leave. So you can hire as much diversity as you want, and maybe in some organization where you have not a lot of representation at the top and they replace one person with someone who looks a little bit different, that person's still probably going to leave pretty quickly if they don't feel like they're able to bring their entire selves to work. So I wouldn't really worry about that. I think if you're a leader in an organization, or if you're trying to convince a leader in an organization to take this on, yeah, it goes back to what Jeffrey was saying and what Gloria was saying about what this means for you as an organization, what the actual motivators are for you as a company, and building that intrinsic motivation for that individual leader to be an inclusive one and to build that inclusive environment. If they've done that, then they're not going to be replaced until they choose to leave, because people value that inclusive behavior, especially from the top, as that gets mimicked further down. People mimic the behaviors of those who are in power, and behaviors day to day are what create a culture. And so if you're a leader and you're behaving inclusively, I don't think you have anything to worry about.
So really excellent points there. Thanks very much, everybody. Gloria, Rafi and Jeffrey, thanks for joining. I think we're running out of time now, but thanks for joining us today, and thank you for all your great insight. Listening to all three of you is always hugely informative for me, and I hope for all our listeners and viewers today. And I hope everyone's able to get some good takeaways from the session. So thanks ever so much. I hope everyone has a good remainder of their day. Thanks, everybody.